Most people drove past the twins that night because they looked like a problem. Ethan Walker stopped because they looked cold. Snow swept sideways across the lonely Montana highway as Ethan's old Ford pickup rattled toward Miller's Gas and Grocery just outside Pine Creek. The heater coughed weak bursts of warm air through the cracked vents, barely enough to fight the December cold creeping through the truck doors. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as the dashboard gas light blinked again. 32 miles left. Maybe less. In the passenger seat, his 8-year-old daughter Lily sat bundled beneath a faded red blanket, drawing little horses on the corner of a grocery receipt with a broken pencil. "Daddy," she asked softly, "can we still make pancakes tomorrow?" Ethan glanced at the folded $20 bill resting beside the cup holder. His last 20 until next Friday. "We'll figure something out," he said quietly. Lily nodded because she trusted him completely. That somehow made it hurt worse. The gas station appeared through the blowing snow like an island of yellow light in a sea of darkness. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed above the pumps. The American flag near the entrance snapped violently in the winter wind. Ethan stepped out, boots crunching across frozen gravel, and pulled his coat tighter around his chest. He could already smell burnt coffee and old motor oil drifting from inside the station. He reached for the truck door to help Lily out when something moved near the vending machine beside the ice cooler. Two small figures, curled close together, shivering. Ethan froze. The girls couldn't have been older than 10. One wore a denim jacket too thin for the weather. The other held her knees tightly against her chest beneath a torn gray hoodie dusted with snow. Their cheeks were red from the cold. Their sneakers looked soaked through. One of them stared at the glowing snack machine like she was trying to survive by looking at food instead of eating it. Ethan slowly walked closer. "You girls okay?" he asked gently. The blonde twin flinched slightly. The other looked up with tired blue eyes that carried far too much fear for a child. "We're fine," she whispered automatically, the way hungry people always did. Ethan noticed her lips trembling. Lily stepped beside her father and quietly removed one glove. "Your hands are purple," she said. The smaller twin tried to smile. "We're just waiting." "For who?" Ethan asked. Neither answered. The wind howled harder between the pumps. Somewhere far down the highway, thunder rolled behind the mountains. Ethan looked back at the gas station window where the cashier pretended not to notice the children outside. Then he looked again at the folded 20 in his hand. Gas or food? Home or kindness? Survival or dignity? Lily tugged gently at his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "they're really hungry." Ethan swallowed once. Hard. Then he walked inside without another word. 10 minutes later, he returned carrying 2 steaming cups of chicken soup for microwave burritos, crackers, apples, and hot chocolate balanced carefully in a cardboard tray. Snow clung to his shoulders as he knelt beside the twins and handed them the food. The girls stared at him in disbelief. "Sir," one whispered shakily, "this is too much." Ethan gave a tired smile. "No," he said softly. "Too much would have been pretending I didn't see you." The twins ate carefully at first, almost embarrassed by how hungry they were. Lily sat beside them sharing crackers while Ethan leaned quietly against the truck beneath the buzzing lights. For the first time all day, nobody spoke. The storm softened around them. Warm breath drifted into the freezing air. And across the highway, partially hidden behind dark, tinted windows, a black SUV remained parked in silence while someone inside slowly lowered a camera. The snowstorm followed Ethan Walker all the way back to the farm like a hungry ghost drifting across the Montana plains. His old pickup bounced along the frozen dirt road while the windshield wipers groaned against thick ice gathering near the edges of the glass. Beside him, Lily had fallen asleep beneath the red blanket, her cheek resting against the window while soft breaths fogged the cold glass. Ethan drove in silence, but his mind stayed back at the gas station. Those girls. Those eyes. The way children learned to say, "We are fine," when life had clearly stopped being fine a long time ago. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The farm finally appeared through the blowing snow just past midnight. The old wooden barn leaned slightly west from years of winter storms. One section of fencing had collapsed completely beneath heavy drifts. The porch light flickered weakly above the farmhouse door like it was tired too. Ethan parked beside the shed and exhaled slowly before stepping out into the bitter wind. The cold hit hard enough to sting his lungs. Somewhere nearby, Loose metal rattled against the barn roof with every gust. Lily stirred awake as he opened her door. "Are we home?" she murmured sleepily. "Yes, sweetheart." Ethan carried her inside while snowflakes melted across his shoulders. The farmhouse smelled like cedar wood, dust, and the faint remains of coffee from that morning. It was not much, but it was warm enough. Lily climbed onto the couch while Ethan knelt beside the old wood stove, feeding another split log into the firebox. Orange flames crackled softly, throwing slow shadows across the worn kitchen walls. For a moment, the silence almost felt peaceful. Then Ethan noticed the envelope sitting on the kitchen table. White, official, folded beneath the salt shaker. His jaw tightened immediately. He already knew. Final notice. Past due balance. Foreclosure review pending. The words blurred together beneath the weak kitchen light while the wind pressed hard against the windows outside. 3 missed payments. 1 more month and the bank would begin seizure proceedings on the farm his grandfather built 50 years earlier with bare hands and borrowed tools. Ethan slowly lowered himself into the kitchen chair. The wood creaked beneath his weight. Across the room, Lily watched him carefully. "Another letter?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded once. "Just paperwork." Lily did not answer right away. She climbed off the couch and quietly walked toward the old cookie jar sitting beside the refrigerator. Ethan frowned slightly as she reached inside and carried something over to the table. Coins, pennies, nickels, dimes, maybe $6 total. She placed them gently beside his hand. "I have my horse money," she whispered. Ethan looked down at the small pile of coins and suddenly felt something heavy twist inside his chest. "Lily, you can use it for the farm." Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes looked too old in that moment, too understanding. Ethan swallowed hard and pulled her gently into his arms. "No," he said quietly against her hair. "That money stays yours." The house settled around them with soft groans from old pipes and winter wood. Outside, snow drifted across the dark fields and silver waves beneath the moonlight. Then came the sound, a faint crunch somewhere beyond the barn. Ethan lifted his head immediately. Another step followed. Slow, careful, not an animal. Lily looked toward the window. "Daddy." Ethan stood without speaking and moved toward the front door. The porch light buzzed weakly overhead as he stepped outside into the freezing air. Wind swept across the empty field. The barn doors creaked softly in the darkness. Then Ethan saw them. 2 small sets of footprints leading through the snow toward the back of the barn. The footprints disappeared behind the barn where the wind could not fully reach. Ethan Walker moved carefully through the snow, his boots sinking several inches into the frozen ground while the porch light faded behind him. The air smelled like ice, hay, and old timber soaked by too many winters. Somewhere inside the barn, wood creaked softly. Ethan stopped near the half-open side door and listened. At first, nothing. Then came the sound again. A small cough. Weak. Human. He pushed the door open slowly. The hinges groaned into the darkness. Cold moonlight spilled across stacked hay bales, rusted tools, and the old tractor that had not run in nearly 3 years. The barn felt like another world at night. Quiet. Hollow. Breathing. "You girls in here?" Ethan asked gently. No answer came immediately. Then Lily's small voice drifted from behind him. "Daddy, over there." Ethan turned toward the far corner beside the horse stall. The twins sat curled together beneath an old canvas tarp, trying desperately to stay warm. One of them was trembling violently now, her pale face flushed red with fever. The other wrapped both arms around her sister protectively the moment Ethan stepped closer. Fear flashed across the girl's eyes again. Not fear of being hurt. Fear of being sent away. "Please," she whispered quickly. "We will leave if you want." Ethan crouched slowly to their level. Snowflakes melted across his jacket shoulders while cold air drifted through the cracks in the barn walls. "Nobody is making you leave tonight," he said softly. The smaller twin looked barely conscious. Ethan placed the back of his hand gently against her forehead and immediately frowned. She was burning up. Lily knelt beside them without hesitation and removed her own wool scarf. "Here," she said quietly, wrapping it around the sick girl's shoulders. The blonde twin stared at her in disbelief. "Why are you helping us?" Lily looked confused by the question itself. "Because you are cold." For a moment, nobody spoke. Wind rattled against the roof while somewhere outside a loose chain tapped softly against metal siding. Ethan stood and pulled an old lantern from the workbench shelf before lighting it with a match. Warm amber light filled the barn slowly, chasing shadows across the wooden beams overhead. He grabbed several thick horse blankets hanging nearby and carried them over carefully. "Can she walk?" he asked. The older twin shook her head slightly. "Her name is Ava," she whispered. "I am Ellie." Ethan nodded once. "All right, Ellie. We are getting Ava inside." Ava tried weakly to protest. "We should not stay." Ethan looked directly at her, calm and steady. "Sometimes pride matters," he said quietly, "and sometimes warmth matters more." He gently lifted Ava into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Lily walked beside him carrying the lantern, while Ellie followed close behind through the blowing snow. Inside the farmhouse, the heat from the wood stove wrapped around them instantly. The girls froze near the doorway, as if they had forgotten what warmth felt like. Ethan laid Ava carefully across the couch, while Lily hurried toward the kitchen. "I will make tea," she announced with sudden purpose. Ethan smiled faintly despite the exhaustion pulling at his face. Ellie remained standing near the door, clutching the torn sleeve of her hoodie tightly in one hand. Her eyes moved across the small farmhouse cautiously. The old photographs, the worn couch, the tiny Christmas decorations Lily had taped crookedly near the fireplace. "Nobody lives like this where we came from," Ellie whispered before she could stop herself. Ethan looked at her carefully then, not the words themselves, the way she said them. Educated, controlled, different. Then something caught Lily's attention beside the couch. "Daddy," she said softly. "Look." Ethan stepped closer. Around Ava's wrist, partially hidden beneath the blanket, was a silver bracelet gleaming in the firelight. Engraved across the polished metal were 4 words Ethan recognized instantly. Brooks Agricultural Holdings. The room fell strangely quiet after Ethan Walker read the words engraved on the silver bracelet. Brooks Agricultural Holdings. Even Lily recognized the name immediately. Everyone in Montana did. Their company logos stood on grain silos, shipping trucks, and feed stores across half the state. Ethan stared at the bracelet for another long second while firelight flickered across the polished metal. Then he slowly looked toward Ellie. The girl froze near the doorway. Her tired blue eyes widened slightly, like someone watching a secret finally rise to the surface. "Where did you get this?" Ethan asked gently. Ellie lowered her gaze. "It belongs to Ava." "I figured that." His voice stayed calm. "What I am asking is why a couple of freezing kids are sleeping in a barn wearing jewelry connected to one of the wealthiest ranching families in America." Ellie swallowed hard but did not answer. Lily quietly carried over a steaming mug of tea and placed it carefully beside Ava on the couch. The younger girl barely stirred beneath the blankets. Her breathing remained shallow and uneven from the fever. Ethan sighed softly and removed his worn work gloves. "Listen," he said. "You do not have to tell me everything tonight. But if someone is looking for you, I need to know what kind of trouble just walked into my home." Wind pressed hard against the farmhouse windows. The old clock above the stove ticked steadily through the silence. Ellie finally looked up. "We are not criminals." Ethan nodded once. "I never said you were." Another pause. Then Ellie whispered something so quietly Ethan almost missed it. "We ran away." Lily sat slowly beside the couch, pulling the red blanket tighter around her shoulders. "From who?" she asked softly. Ellie hesitated again. The hesitation itself said enough. Not danger, not cruelty, something more complicated, something powerful. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair while the fire crackled low behind him. He remembered hearing stories about the Brooks family for years. Billion-dollar cattle contracts, private jets landing near Billings, lawyers, boardrooms, land stretching farther than most people could drive in a day. Men like Daniel Brooks did not appear in newspapers smiling beside children. They appeared shaking hands with governors and senators. "Your parents know where you are?" Ethan asked carefully. Ellie's face tightened instantly. "No." "Do they know you are gone?" Tears suddenly gathered in her eyes, though she fought hard not to let them fall. "Please do not call anybody." The words came out trembling now. "Please." Ethan studied her quietly. Children could lie. Fear usually could not. Before he could answer, headlights swept briefly across the kitchen windows from outside. Bright, slow-moving. Everyone in the room froze. Ethan stood immediately and walked toward the curtains. Through the blowing snow, he saw dark shapes moving down the county road beyond the field. Large vehicles. Black. Their headlights glowed pale against the storm before disappearing again behind the trees. Lily's voice dropped to a whisper. "Daddy?" Ethan kept watching the road. Probably just travelers. But deep down he knew better. Nobody drove that road during a blizzard unless they already knew exactly where they were going. Ava stirred weakly on the couch, murmuring through her fever, "Do not let them take us back." Ethan turned slowly toward her. The room suddenly felt smaller somehow. Warmer too. Like the house itself understood that something had changed the moment those girls crossed the doorway. He walked back toward the stove and added another log to the fire. Sparks floated upward through the dim kitchen light. Then he looked at Ellie again. Calm, steady, quiet. "Nobody is taking anyone anywhere tonight," he said. Ellie stared at him in stunned silence. Outside, somewhere beyond the frozen fields and drifting snow, the distant glow of black SUVs moved slowly through the darkness toward Ethan Walker's dying farm. Morning arrived gray and heavy over the Montana plains. Snow clung to the fences in thick white ribbons while cold wind rolled across Ethan Walker's farm like an endless tide. The storm had weakened overnight, but the silence afterward somehow felt louder. Inside the farmhouse, the smell of cinnamon tea and wood smoke drifted softly through the kitchen. Ava still slept beneath 3 blankets on the couch, her fever finally beginning to break. Ellie sat quietly beside her sister, watching the flames in the stove with tired eyes that looked far older than 10 years old. Lily moved carefully around the kitchen, making burnt toast with complete concentration like it was the most important job in the world. Ethan stood at the sink staring out the frosted window toward the barn. Tire tracks. Fresh ones. Deep and wide. They cut through the snow along the county road sometime before dawn. He had not imagined the vehicles last night. Someone really had been out there. A knock suddenly echoed through the farmhouse. 3 firm knocks. Not angry. Not hesitant either. Ethan glanced toward the girls instantly. Ellie stiffened beside the couch. Ava opened her eyes halfway in sudden panic. "It is okay," Ethan said quietly, though he was no longer entirely sure. He walked toward the front door while old floorboards creaked beneath his boots. Outside stood Sheriff Tom Bennett wrapped in a heavy winter coat dusted with snow. Behind him sat a dark county SUV idling near the fence line. The sheriff removed his gloves slowly. "Morning, Ethan." "Tom." The sheriff's expression looked uncomfortable. That alone made Ethan wary. They had known each other nearly 15 years. Small-town familiarity had a way of teaching men how to read silence better than words. Sheriff Bennett glanced briefly past Ethan into the farmhouse. "Mind if I ask you something?" Ethan crossed his arms against the cold. "Depends what it is." The sheriff sighed softly. 2 girls have been reported missing out near Billings. Ethan said nothing. Bennett continued carefully. "Private investigators are already involved. Wealthy family. Real wealthy." Wind rattled the porch railing between them. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked across the frozen fields. "People around town saw you at Miller's station last night," Bennett said. "Saw you talking to 2 kids." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Hungry kids. Maybe." The sheriff lowered his voice further. "Listen to me carefully. There are already black SUVs parked outside the diner in Pine Creek this morning. Men asking questions. Nobody knows who they work for exactly, but folks are nervous." Ethan looked beyond the sheriff toward the road disappearing through the snow. "And what do you think?" Bennett hesitated. "I think you are not stupid enough to kidnap children." Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. Behind him, a floorboard creaked softly inside the house. Bennett heard it too. His eyes flickered toward the doorway for half a second before returning to Ethan. Then something unexpected happened. The sheriff removed his hat slowly and rubbed a tired hand across his face. "You know," he said quietly, "my mother used to hide strangers in our church basement during blizzards when I was a kid. Travelers. Families. Folks with nowhere else to go. Drove my father crazy." Ethan remained silent. Bennett gave a faint smile. "She used to say kindness was the only thing that kept winter from turning people cold inside." The wind eased briefly around them. Snow drifted softly off the barn roof in slow white clouds. Then the sheriff looked Ethan directly in the eye. "If those girls are here," he said carefully, "I did not see them." Ethan stared at him for a long moment. Respect passed quietly between the 2 men without needing explanation. Bennett stepped backward off the porch. "But Ethan," he added, voice lowering again, "whoever is searching for those kids is getting closer." As if the universe itself answered him, the low hum of engines rolled faintly across the frozen plains beyond the county road. Deep, expensive, controlled. Ethan turned slowly toward the sound. Through the drifting snow in the distance, dark vehicles began appearing one by one along the horizon. The black SUVs arrived just after noon like shadows rolling across the snow. One after another, they moved slowly down the frozen county road toward Ethan Walker's farm with headlights glowing pale against the gray Montana sky. The engines were almost silent, expensive enough to whisper instead of roar. Inside the farmhouse, nobody spoke. Ava sat upright now beneath the blankets, still weak but awake, while Ellie stood frozen near the kitchen window watching the convoy approach. Lily quietly reached for her hand. "It is okay," she whispered. Ellie looked at her with heartbreaking uncertainty. "You do not know that." Outside, tires crunched across packed snow as the vehicles came to a stop beside the fence line. 6 SUVs. Maybe more. Men stepped out wearing dark wool coats and leather gloves, their polished shoes sinking awkwardly into the slush around the driveway. None of them looked like police. None looked relaxed either. Ethan stood near the stove, calm but alert, his flannel shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. He had seen enough hard winters to understand one simple truth. Sometimes storms arrived wearing snow. Sometimes they arrived wearing money. A soft knock finally echoed through the farmhouse. Not aggressive. Controlled. Respectful even. Ethan walked toward the front door while the room behind him held its breath. The moment he opened it, cold wind swept inside, carrying the smell of pine and fresh snow. Standing on the porch was a woman unlike anyone Pine Creek had probably ever seen up close. Tall, elegant, mid-30s maybe. Her cream-colored winter coat fell nearly to her knees, untouched by the storm despite the snow swirling around her. Chestnut hair framed a pale face marked by exhaustion more than makeup. But it was her eyes that stopped Ethan completely. Red from crying. Terrified. Hopeful. Human. The woman looked past him once into the farmhouse, and the moment she saw the girls, her breath caught painfully in her throat. "Ava," she whispered. "Ellie." Both girls froze. Then Ava suddenly burst into tears. "Mom." The sound shattered something inside the room all at once. Claire Brooks rushed forward without another word, kneeling instantly as both girls threw themselves into her arms. The force of relief in that tiny farmhouse felt almost sacred. Ellie cried silently against her mother's shoulder, while Ava clung to her coat, like someone afraid the world might pull them apart again. Claire held both daughters tightly, trembling as tears streamed freely down her face. "I am so sorry," she whispered over and over. "I am so sorry." Ethan stepped back quietly, giving them space while firelight flickered softly across the kitchen walls. Even Lily looked emotional now, clutching the edge of her sweater as she watched the reunion unfold beside the wood stove. Outside, the men near the SUVs remained perfectly still. No one interrupted. No one spoke. After several long moments, Claire finally lifted her tear-filled eyes toward Ethan. For a second, she could not even seem to form words. She looked around the tiny farmhouse slowly. The worn furniture, the patched curtains, the old stove glowing warmly in the corner. Then back at Ethan standing there in old work boots and a faded flannel shirt. A struggling farmer with foreclosure notices on his table who had still chosen kindness over caution. Claire swallowed hard. "You took them in," she said softly, almost disbelieving it. Ethan shrugged lightly. They were cold. Claire stared at him like no one had ever answered her that simply before. Most people would have called someone. Ethan glanced toward the girls huddled safely beside the fire. Maybe. Silence settled gently through the room again. Not awkward silence. The kind built from exhaustion, relief, and Grace finally finding somewhere to rest. Then Claire noticed the pile of coins still sitting on the kitchen table beside the foreclosure letter. Her expression changed immediately. She looked at Ethan differently now. Not like a poor farmer. Not like a stranger. Like a man carrying burdens quietly without letting them harden his heart. Outside, snow drifted slowly across the black SUVs while the entire farm stood wrapped in winter silence. And for the first time since arriving in Pine Creek, Claire Brooks looked at someone without seeing money, power, or fear. She saw dignity. The storm finally began to fade by late afternoon, leaving the Montana sky washed pale silver above the frozen fields. Inside Ethan Walker's farmhouse, warmth slowly returned not just to the room, but to the people inside it. Ava sat wrapped in blankets beside the stove sipping broth from one of Lily's chipped mugs while Ellie remained close to her mother as though letting go might make her disappear again. Claire Brooks had removed her expensive coat hours ago, yet somehow she still looked out of place inside the tiny farmhouse kitchen. Not because she acted superior, because grief and wealth rarely knew what to do with simple kindness. Ethan stood at the sink washing dishes quietly while Lily showed Ava old horse drawings she kept in a shoebox beside the couch. Their laughter came softly at first, uncertain and fragile, but real. Claire watched them with damp eyes. I have not heard them laugh like that in months, she admitted quietly. Ethan dried his hands with a kitchen towel and leaned lightly against the counter. Kids usually remember how once they feel safe. Claire lowered her gaze at those words. Safe. The word seemed to wound her somehow. For a long moment, only the crackling fire filled the silence between them. Then Claire finally spoke again. You deserve the truth. Ethan nodded once, but did not interrupt. Outside the farmhouse windows, black SUVs remained parked quietly near the fence line, while men in dark coats waited respectfully beside them. Nobody rushed her. Nobody pushed inside. The power surrounding Claire Brooks moved differently than most wealth. Controlled. Careful. Heavy. Claire folded her hands together tightly. My father built Brooks Agricultural Holdings from almost nothing, she began softly. By the time I inherited part of the company, it owned cattle ranches, shipping lines, grain operations, and farmland across 5 states. Ethan listened quietly while snow drifted gently beyond the windows. When my husband died 2 years ago, everything changed, Claire continued. Board members started fighting over shares. Lawyers became involved. Family members I had not spoken to in years suddenly wanted custody arrangements, financial oversight, influence over the girls. Her voice tightened slightly now. To them, Ava and Ellie were not children anymore. They were leverage. Ethan frowned faintly. Claire looked toward her daughters beside the fire. The girls heard more than people realized. Meetings. Arguments. Men talking about inheritance percentages while my daughters sat in the next room coloring pictures. Shame flickered across her expression. I thought I could protect them by keeping everything controlled. Structured. Private. Ellie lowered her eyes quietly. But it just made us feel trapped, she whispered. Claire's face crumpled slightly hearing that. Ethan noticed the guilt immediately. Not the guilt of failure. The guilt of a mother who had been surviving for so long she forgot survival was not the same thing as living. Ava looked toward Ethan then, clutching the warm mug carefully in both hands. When we ran away, she said softly, most people ignored us. Ellie nodded. Or they looked scared once they recognized us. The room fell quiet again. Then Ava looked directly at Ethan. You were the first person who looked at us like regular kids. Ethan stared at the fire for a moment before answering. Hunger makes everybody equal. Claire's eyes filled again. She glanced toward the foreclosure notice still sitting partly folded on the kitchen table beside Lily's jar of coins. A struggling farmer who could barely save his own home had still chosen to spend his last dollars feeding strangers. The realization seemed to humble her more than any business meeting or courtroom ever could. Then suddenly one of the security men outside approached the porch carefully and removed his hat before knocking once on the door. Ethan opened it slightly. Ma'am, the man said respectfully toward Claire. Your father just arrived. Silence spread instantly across the farmhouse. Even the fire seemed quieter somehow. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Ellie gripped Ava's hand tighter. And out beyond the snowy pasture, another black SUV slowly rolled through the gate. The final SUV stopped beside Ethan Walker's farmhouse just as the sun began sinking behind the snow-covered hills. Pale golden light stretched across the frozen fields, turning the drifting snow almost silver. Nobody inside the house moved at first. Claire Brooks stood slowly from the kitchen table, while Ava and Ellie held tightly to each side of her coat. Even the security men outside straightened subtly as the rear passenger door opened. An older man stepped carefully onto the snow, tall despite his age, broad shoulders hidden beneath a dark wool overcoat. Silver hair brushed neatly back from a weathered face that looked carved by decades of responsibility rather than comfort. Daniel Brooks carried himself like the kind of man entire boardrooms went silent around. Yet the moment he looked toward the farmhouse window and saw his granddaughters standing safely inside, something in his expression softened instantly. Not weakness, relief, pure and quiet. Ethan watched from the doorway as Daniel slowly approached the porch through the snow. The billionaire ranch owner moved without bodyguards beside him, without arrogance, without hurry. Just one old man crossing a frozen yard toward his family. Behind him, the black SUVs remained still beneath the fading sky, like silent monuments to a world Ethan had never belonged to. Daniel stopped at the porch steps and removed his leather gloves carefully. For a second, neither man spoke. Wind drifted softly through the fence posts, while somewhere far off a crow called across the empty plains. Then Daniel Brooks looked Ethan directly in the eye. "You are Ethan Walker." It was not a question. Ethan nodded once. "Yes, sir." Daniel glanced briefly inside the farmhouse where Ava and Ellie stood wrapped in blankets near the stove. His jaw tightened slightly at the sight of them looking healthy again. "Warm. Safe. My daughter tells me you sheltered my granddaughters during the storm," he said quietly. Ethan shrugged lightly. Any decent person would have. Daniel's eyes lingered on him for another long moment. "No," he said softly. "Not any person." Silence settled between them, heavy but respectful. Claire stepped onto the porch then, tears threatening her eyes again. "Dad?" Daniel looked toward her, and for just a moment the billionaire disappeared completely. He became only a father seeing his exhausted daughter after too much fear and too little sleep. He touched her shoulder gently. "You should have called me sooner." Claire lowered her eyes. "I know." Daniel nodded once before turning back toward Ethan. His gaze shifted briefly toward the foreclosure notice still visible on the kitchen table through the open doorway, then toward the nearly empty pantry shelves behind it, then toward Lily sitting beside Ava sharing pieces of burnt toast like it was treasure. Something changed in the old man's face then. Quiet understanding. He stepped forward unexpectedly and extended his hand. Ethan accepted it firmly. Daniel held the handshake longer than anyone expected. "A man who is almost nothing," Daniel said slowly, "still gave his last dollars to hungry children he did not know." His voice lowered further. "That kind of character cannot be bought anymore." Nobody on the porch moved. Even the wind seemed to pause around them. The security men near the SUVs looked away respectfully, as if recognizing something deeply personal unfolding in front of them. Ethan shifted slightly uncomfortable beneath the praise. "They needed help." Daniel nodded once. "And someday your daughter will understand exactly what kind of father she was raised by." Lily stood quietly inside the doorway, hearing every word. Her eyes grew glassy instantly. Claire looked toward Ethan differently now too. Not with pity, not with gratitude alone, with admiration, deep and undeniable. Then Daniel reached slowly into his coat pocket and removed a folded document envelope. He held it out toward Ethan calmly. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "a representative from Brooks Agricultural Holdings will arrive at your farm." Ethan frowned slightly. "For what?" Daniel's weathered face softened into the faintest smile. "To discuss why this land will never belong to the bank again." Spring arrived slowly across Pine Creek, but when it finally came, it felt like the whole valley had exhaled after a long and unforgiving winter. Snow melted from the fence posts in shining drops. The frozen creek behind Ethan Walker's farm began moving again beneath pale morning sunlight. Fields that had once looked gray and dying now stretched green beneath the Montana sky. And for the first time in years, the old Walker farm no longer felt like a place waiting to disappear. The repairs had started quietly. That was the strange part. No newspaper headlines. No giant announcements. Just trucks arriving before sunrise carrying lumber, fencing, seed, and equipment. Men worked respectfully without turning Ethan's life into charity theater. The broken barn roof was repaired first. Then the fencing. Then came the tractor. Brand new. Deep red paint shining beneath the morning sun, like something pulled from another lifetime Ethan thought he had already lost. He stood silently in the driveway the morning it arrived, hands buried in his jacket pockets while Lily nearly screamed with excitement beside him. "Daddy," she gasped, "it is beautiful." Ethan only nodded because sometimes gratitude became too large for words. Claire Brooks visited often after that. At first, she came only to check on Ava and Ellie, who now spent nearly every weekend at the farm helping Lily feed horses and chase chickens through the muddy spring grass. But slowly something gentler began growing there too. Healing. Claire traded designer coats for denim jackets and muddy boots. She learned how to repair fence wire beside Ethan beneath open skies instead of office ceilings. Some evenings they sat quietly on the porch after dinner while the girls laughed somewhere near the barn. Neither rushed the silence between them. Neither needed to. One evening, as golden sunsets spilled across the fields, Claire glanced toward Ethan rocking slowly in the old porch chair beside her. "You know," she said softly, "people spent years trying to impress me." Ethan smirked faintly without looking away from the horizon. "Sounds exhausting." Claire laughed quietly at that. Then her expression softened. "You were the first person who treated me like a human being instead of a last name." Ethan looked down at his weathered hands for a moment before answering. "Money changes how people look at you." Claire nodded slowly. "Yes." The wind moved gently through the tall grass around the porch, while distant horses shifted near the fence line. "But kindness changes how people remember you," Ethan said quietly. Claire looked at him, then with something deeper than admiration in her eyes. Something calm, safe, real. Down near the barn, Ava and Ellie raced across the field beside Lily, their laughter echoing through the evening air. No fear, no lawyers, no security teams hovering over their shoulders. Just children finally allowed to be children again. And standing near the fence watching them was Daniel Brooks himself, hands resting atop a wooden post while sunset reflected softly across his silver hair. The old billionaire noticed Ethan watching him and gave a single respectful nod across the field. Nothing more. None was needed. Because some men measured wealth in acres, contracts, and accounts. Others measured it in the people who still slept peacefully under their roof at night. Ethan Walker finally understood something then as he looked across the farm glowing gold beneath the Montana sky. The miracle had never really been the SUVs, or the money, or even the saved farm. The miracle was that after losing almost everything, he had somehow managed to keep the one thing this world could not afford to lose anymore: his kindness. And in the quiet heart of Pine Creek, surrounded by fields reborn after winter, that quiet kindness changed every life it touched.